Hello, SAGES members. My name is Georgios Karagkounis. I am a resident in general surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, and I have with me Dr. David Urbach, professor of surgery at the University of Toronto and chair of the SAGES Research and Career Development Committee. The topic of our discussion today will be how to write a grant, and we will try to offer our fellow SAGES members practical advice for their future submissions. Hello, Dr. Urbach. Would you like to add anything before we start discussing grant writing?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be involved with this.
Okay, let's start from the beginning then. And what is for many of us the toughest part? How do you pick your study question?
So I think the really important thing when you're picking your research question is to find a question that you're very interested in. Because if you don't find a topic that excites you, it's going to be very difficult for you to put enough energy into it to be able to write a good grant, and even beyond that, to be able to do the research afterwards. And in order to be a great question, it shouldn't just be exciting to you. It also has to be novel and important, and it has to pass what we call the "so what" test, which means what's the whole point of doing your study. So you should look for questions that are relevant, that are important, and will make a real contribution to the literature.
So great, assuming I now have my exciting question and I have identified the grant that I'm applying for, do I start writing right away?
So that's a great question, and the answer that I always give to someone who tells me, how do you write, I say the first step in writing is don't write. So before you actually write anything, you actually have to work to get your thoughts in order and to pin down all the concepts and the key ideas. And you do that not by writing, but by starting with outlines and pushing around concepts and bullet lists and things like that. So what you want to do is start early and start with something that I call a concept sheet, which is a one-page draft document that goes through things like your specific aims, a bit of the relevant background, a summary of the analytic approach, and your expected findings, and it does these things in point form. And what you can now do is take your concept sheet and circulate it to your mentors and colleagues and collaborators and get feedback on those key points that will ultimately turn into the grant proposal. So what you're not doing is asking people to read large amounts of your writing, but to provide feedback on concepts. And the other really important thing with writing is to keep it simple. Remember, you're writing for reviewers who you can consider to be educated experts, but non-specialists in your area. And as much as possible, keep your writing clear, simple, relevant. Get feedback on all your writing, and make sure you don't ignore feedback, because if anyone has a question about anything you've written, whether they're right or wrong, another person is likely to have the same question. So make sure you always take advice and incorporate feedback. And anytime you're looking at your own writing and you're having trouble understanding what you meant, or if it seems at all too complex, I can guarantee you it's too complicated and you have to make it much more simple.
Thank you. This is certainly very helpful. Then we have preliminary data. Are they necessary only for the multi-million NIH grants, or should we be worried for them even for smaller grants?
Preliminary data are needed for every grant that you apply for. And the reason is this is a great way for you to highlight the feasibility of your project and show that you're able to actually conduct the research. There's no better way to demonstrate your capability of doing the research by demonstrating that you've done something very similar in the past. And the other important thing about preliminary data is, and we'll talk about this soon, is that they're very useful for providing some information that may help you get an estimate for the sample size you'll need for your study.
Then let's move on to the core of the grant, namely the specific aims and the methodology to address them. What advice would you have for our viewers?
So the most important part of the grant always is the specific aims. And this is what you have to spend a lot of time nailing down and getting good feedback and refining with your study team. Ultimately, the specific aims of your grant are going to form the basis of the report that the peer reviewers have to do when they defend your grant in the peer review committee. So you have to spend a lot of time on getting the research aims perfect, getting them crisp, getting them clear, making sure they're feasible and appropriate. And you may want to highlight a conceptual framework or some sort of theoretical idea on which the research aims are drawn. As you draft the methods of your project, make sure all the methods are linked to the aims. And the best way to do that is, as you describe methods, refer to the specific aim that relates to those methods. And you use language like, to accomplish specific aim number one, and here you say, what's specific aim number one? We will do the following. And you'll explain how you will sample subjects or make your measurements or whatever the research activities are. And this ensures that the proposal is presented in a clear and understandable way, and there's no doubt of what the methods are trying to achieve because you're linking them explicitly back to the aims of your research. And as you draft the methods, you're thinking that you're spoon-feeding material to the reviewers because it's very difficult to review a grant. Reviewers typically have to read lots of grants. They have lots of constraints on their time and multiple competing demands. So you really have to help a reviewer read your grant so you can help them be your best advocate when they represent your grant to a peer review committee. So make sure you have lots of overviews, that you summarize often, that you use very clear and succinct language because you really don't want to make the life of your reviewers difficult. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to understand exactly what you're doing so that they can describe it to the review committee.
So is this the part of the grant where the sample size also becomes relevant?
The sample size part of a grant is the critical part of the grant because it establishes not just a scientific or methodological issue, which is did you appropriately design your study, but it's a key ethical issue, which is it even ethical to do the study? And what I mean by that is it's only ethical to involve participants or animals or research subjects in a study if the study can actually achieve an objective. So is the study large enough to detect an effect if we think it's possible? And is it large enough to exclude an effect where, with enough certainty where that's appropriate? So there's a lot of important considerations that go into estimating the sample size, and you really need assistance from a statistician or an expert if you're not an expert yourself. So you need to be able to ask yourself questions like, what is the effect size we want to detect? With what statistical power do we want to do that? What are some estimates of standard deviations or estimates of variation around these measures? And you do have to be very careful because peer reviewers are very savvy at very quickly determining if the sample size calculation is appropriate or not.
So assuming that we followed all the steps, even the greatest studies have certain limitations. Are these important to discuss? Because I know that many young investigators like myself worry that this may backfire and point to parts of the grant that we would like to remain hidden.
So all studies have limitations, and it's important for you to own your limitations. So what you don't want to do is try and hide them or not mention them in the hope that that somehow the reviewers may not notice them, because undoubtedly they will notice them, and it's going to make them think that you haven't really thought through your methods. So what you want to do is put your limitations front and center in a limitations section, and you want to mitigate them one by one. You can say something along the lines of, one might think that this is a limitation of our study. However, it's not as much of a limitation as you might think because, and then you can provide some justification for that. And you really have to very strongly make the case that you have alternative strategies if something doesn't work out, and that the reviewers can have a lot of confidence that you'll be able to manage the research project.
Then at the end of most grants, there is a section on the timeline, the members of the research team, the budget. Are these just a formality that we should fill in at the last moment?
I would say these are not a formality because all of these things are taken into consideration by reviewers reviewers, and in fact, reviewers often have a checklist and they evaluate each of these things as well. So a timeline is very useful because it shows that you've thought through the what it will take to actually get the research accomplished. It will help you structure your budget, especially if you know how much time people are going to be spending on the research. And if you include a table or a Gantt chart that shows the timeline, it really demonstrates that you're thoughtful and you've done a lot of preparation. The research team is very important for you to describe. It really helps establish the feasibility of your project if you can show that you've got experts who can handle all the areas of the research, particularly if you don't have expertise yourself. And it's important to describe the role of all the members of the research team. You don't want to just list 10 people, but you want to say what exactly is it that each person is going to do. And finally, the budget is a key part of the grant. And my advice for budgets is make sure every item is justified. Imagine that the reviewers are starting with a $0 budget, and they will start with $0, and you have to justify every line item above that. So it's not just enough to write amounts for the line items, but you have to describe exactly why it's necessary. And if there's anything you need an estimate for, it's very helpful to append a copy of the estimate with the grant itself.
That makes great sense, and certainly we should encourage our listeners and viewers to pay attention to every part of the grant application, because sometimes the seemingly least important one can be your undoing. So I understand that I have to describe my strengths and explain why I am in the best position to carry out the proposed work. Wouldn't that make me sound too arrogant, though?
So the one time for self-promotion is when you're writing your grant. And the general idea you want to provide the reviewers is that this question is the most important question ever, that you are the only person who's able to do it because you have the special expertise and knowledge and abilities, and this grant that you're proposing is the one grant they absolutely have to fund. So if you're thinking that that's your goal, you'll be able to describe your own training and interest and expertise in a way that really supports your ability to do the project. So you don't want to be modest. You want to emphasize your track record. You want to describe the environment, and you want to emphasize as well all the collaborators on the project who have any special expertise if in fact you don't have any of that expertise yourself.
So let's now shift gears and focus on the negatives, the pitfalls that commonly plague our grants. What are some of the most important problems you find in the grants you review? How can our reviewers avoid them?
So first and foremost, a grant has to be scientifically valid, and we haven't spent too much time talking about that, but you can take it for granted that it absolutely has to be good science. But even a grant that's perfect in its methodology and its scientific validity, if it's not addressing an important question, it's not going to be funded. If the grant is written in a way that it's not really understandable what you want to do, it won't be funded. And if there's any question that it's not feasible, if the reviewer has any question that you won't be able to complete the grant successfully, then they won't fund it. So ambitious is generally a very positive term, but an ambitious grant is generally not a good grant when it comes to a safe grant for funding. It's important to always follow the rules, and all grant opportunities are very specific about page numbers, sometimes about spacing and font. Make sure you follow the rules to the letter. Make sure that your spelling and grammar are correct. It's not a turn on to reviewers if they're noticing spelling errors. And you have to follow all the rules with respect to budget, format, and copies if it's a hard copy that you're submitting. There are a lot of stylistic issues when you do your writing. You don't want to have dense text like solid paragraphs, justified left and justified right, filling up all the pages, but you want to leave lots of white space. Use figures and tables liberally so you can break up the text and use illustrations to highlight ideas. Whenever you can, use bulleted lists and boxes. especially when you want to highlight reviewers' attentions for key parts, and summarize often. So it's always okay to say, in summary, this is the background, and use that as a transitional statement that will lead into your methods, for example, or lead one part of the methods to the next. And as much as possible, use the expository style of writing that we all learned about in high school and in undergraduate university, with topic sentences and concluding sentences, so that your writing is very clear. And finally, you don't want to focus excessively on style, because the stylistic points will never compensate for a proposal that's not an excellent scientific proposal. And when you want to get feedback, remember the feedback is on the concepts. You don't want people to keep reading your final grant and giving you comments on your language, and really strive to get the feedback early on the concept sheet. So the idea is that at first you get it down, then you get it right, and once everyone's agreed, all your collaborators, and you've gotten advice on those things, then you can get it perfect, and then you can flesh out all the paragraphs from the outline that you've created.
And then once that's done, the grant should be ready for submission, and there comes the review process. So could you, as an experienced reviewer, describe the grant review process for our audience and help them understand how facilitating the reviewer's job can actually be crucial to the success of a proposal?
So most young researchers are shocked that practically nobody ever reads their grant. And here's the sad truth. One or two people will ever read your entire grant from start to finish. And it's only one of them that really needs to read it carefully. So these are the people who have to really represent your grant to a peer review committee, and you have to help them do that, because the committee is going to discuss your proposal, and as much as possible, they're going to highlight the limitations and the negatives. So you really have to help these reviewers understand the positives. It's an idea where you're helping them help you. They're the advocates, and you have to think that what you're doing when you write your grant is you're almost writing their report that they have to present to the peer review committee, and you're embedding that within the grant. So you want to highlight the key chunks that they can cut and paste into their report, and you can find out what the evaluation criteria are for your grant. Almost all grant opportunities publish the evaluation criteria, and make sure you address each of those criteria. Make sure you clearly highlight the importance of your project, provide lots of evidence of feasibility so that the reviewers can reassure the committee that, I have no doubt that these applicants are able to complete this, and really help them be your best advocate.
So with all that in mind, let's go off to the take-home points. What are the absolute essentials from what we've discussed today that our viewers should keep in mind when writing a grant? How would you summarize this?
So I don't want to detract at all from the scientific validity, because that really is the most important part of the grant. But the key message is that an excellent scientific application by itself will not get you funded. What you really need to do is focus on the specific aims and the methods, as we've discussed, making sure that the aims are important and exciting and interesting, closely linked to the methods, and that are very feasible. You want to start early and get input early on key concepts rather than on style. And remember the fatal flaws. You don't want to have a grant that's asking an unimportant question. You definitely don't want to write a grant where anyone might be concerned that the research may not be completed successfully. And it has to be a clear and interesting proposal, because if your reviewers don't understand what you've written, then they're not going to be enthusiastic about supporting it in front of the peer review committee. And you do want to get feedback, but as I've said, you want to get feedback early on concepts with your outline, not give someone a written grant and ask them to copy edit your English writing.
And if I can add one last thing as a younger investigator is, don't get discouraged. The first few grants that any one of us submits are probably not going to be the best ones of our career, and if the first ones don't go that well, there is still time to get feedback from more senior investigators and improve. So Dr. Urbach, I'm sure I speak on behalf of our audience too when I say thank you very, very much for your time and for sharing your experience with us. And to our audience, thank you for watching. We'll encourage you to put your own questions into a grant, starting with the upcoming cycle of SAGE's research grants this fall.